My work for the past 20 years has been focused really on trying to answer one single question. The question that I've been trying to answer is how can we peacefully address our most complex and conflictual social challenges. With my colleagues in Rios, we've worked on challenges ranging from health to food systems, to education, to justice, to development, to sustainability, to peace. The main advantage to working on one question for 20 years is that you have an opportunity for lots of trial and lots of error, and so lots of learning. And so what I thought would be most productive for this presentation is to review some of these experiences of the past 20 years, and in particular to tell you 3 stories from 3 different parts of the world. And out of these stories to draw out 4 lessons or 4 models or 4 theories. One of the founders of our field was a man named Kurt Lewin. Kurt Lewin was famous for saying that there's nothing as practical as a good theory. Nothing as practical as a good theory, and so I thought that perhaps the most practical thing I could do would be to share these stories and in particular these theories. The way I got started in this work that we're going to talk to you about this afternoon was in the late 1980s in London. I was working for the strategic planning department of the oil company Shell in London. Shell's particular approach to strategic planning is well known for its use of a specific methodology for thinking about the future, or making strategy, or deciding on the way forward. And this particular approach is known as the scenario method. I'm using the word scenarios here in a very specific way. By scenarios, we mean a story about the future, and in particular, a story not about what will happen, not a prediction, not about what should happen, not a plan or a vision, but a story about what might happen. And this idea of using stories about what might happen, stories with very specific criteria, which are relevant, which are challenging, which are plausible, and which are clear, have been used now for 40 years as the basis for strategizing, for trying to understand what's going on, what might go on, what should we do about it in Shell and other corporations. The famous first use of scenarios in Shell was in the early 1970s by the founder of the department, Pierre Bach, who talked already in 1972 about that the oil market might muddle through, might continue to go as it had, or there might be a crisis. And as you remember your oil industry history, there was in fact a crisis in 1973. It's not that Shell did anything different before the crisis, but the crisis helped them, but the scenarios helped them understand what had happened, helped them see what was happening, helped them interpret, helped them make sense of what was happening in the world around them. And this, among other things, is thought to have been one of the reasons why Shell went from being the weakest of the so-called 7 sisters, the 7 private oil companies, to one of the strongest. So this is the department I was in Shell. And I was happily going on making scenarios for Shell when in 1991 we received an unexpected request at our offices in London from some activists in South Africa that had heard about the Shell scenario methodology and wanted to use it to think about the transition that was unfolding in South Africa. You may remember the chronology. Nelson Mandela was released from prison and the opposition parties were legalized in 1990, but the first democratic elections were not until 1994. So this whole period of transition, 1991, 92, 93, 94, hard to remember now, but it was a very uncertain, very frightening, a roller coaster. Negotiations would start, they'd break down, there'd be riots, there'd be assassinations. Really, nobody was, people were having trouble understanding what was happening, what might happen, what they should do about it. And this group of activists in Cape Town thought that maybe the Shell scenario planning methodology could be helpful in thinking through this situation. And when they called Shell, they were asking for methodological advice. And because at the time I was the youngest and most expendable member of our department, I was sent to Cape Town in September 1991 to offer methodological assistance. There were a number of things that really struck me on that first trip. I think the first and maybe most important thing that I learned on that trip, when I arrived at the conference center, it's called the Montefiore Conference Center. It's about an hour outside of Cape Town in the beautiful Helderberg Mountains. I found that the team I was working with was not like the team that I was used to in Shell. It wasn't people just from one organization, but they had put together a team, a scenario team of 28 persons, really from all parts of South African society. From the just legalized opposition, Nelson Mandela's African National Congress, but also from other opposition parties, from trade unions, from the Communist Party, from citizens organizations like the Black Sash, academics, economists, and also members of the establishment, the Chamber of Mines, the establishment industry, most identified with the apartheid system, and with other members of the ruling party, the white minority government. So I found, much to my surprise, that I was doing a scenario exercise with people from the opposition, the establishment, from the furthest extremes of left and right, all the way from the Communist Party to the Conservative Party, black and white. And this team used the Shell scenario method. We did the work exactly as we had done it in Shell. I didn't know any other way to do it, and so just like in Shell, we constructed a series of stories through long debate, long argument. They constructed the scenarios, not me, about what might happen in South Africa. Now, these stories are not really relevant in Thailand in 2010. They're not even really relevant in South Africa in 2010. But in 1992, they were very relevant in South Africa. They pointed to the most essential questions about what might happen. Not what should happen, not what would happen, but what might happen in South Africa. First of all, they asked the question, would there in fact be a negotiated settlement? There were certainly members of the white establishment that thought that it would be possible to prevent a democratic settlement. And the team, which included members of that establishment, after their long debate, came to the conclusion this outcome would lead to a scenario that they called ostrich. Ostrich meaning a government that sticks its head in the sand, denies reality, and just hopes the problem will go away. And the team was asserting that ostrich could only work temporarily. Eventually, the government would have to pull its head out of the sand and confront the situation. At the time, the constitutional negotiations had begun between all the parties, and one of the most important questions, the conservative